If we do what we currently what we're doing, we would still, screw up the earth, because we don't have good stewardship of the resources that are at our disposal. That's why it is so easy to talk about population control. It is much more complicated to really talk about how we arrange our lives, how society sort of is really a civil society and takes care of its resources. Yeah.
Just a quick question. This is the United States, North America,
right.
The United States and Canada, or in current terms, the most advanced, technically advanced economies. And here, infant morbidity and mortality, as well as longevity, are actually going in the other direction. Longevity has gotten shorter.
Right.
Doesn't that imply, beyond a demographic model, or this model anyway, in a larger human ecology model, that there are some kind of forces going on in our environment that are actually correcting the population beyond things like regulation? I mean, why would we create regulations that cause longevity to go down?
No, we don't.
The population increases.
Yeah, we don't cause those regulations. What we do in this country is that we don't have a good health system. We don't have a universal health system. You go, let me finish now. You go over to Cuba. The Cuban, which is an extremely poor country, very, very poor. Cuban life expectancy is 5 months lower than the average American life, US American life expectancy. 5 months. We should be 10 years above Cuba. And the reason we aren't is that Cuba has a very good comprehensive primary health system. And we are fighting tooth and nail, and we insure our cars, but we don't insure ourselves. And that's a big difference. You go to, I lived the last 20 years in Louisiana. In the Mississippi Delta, life expectancy is probably 5 years lower than in Cuba. It's poverty, it's inavailability or no access to health plans, that sort of stuff. It is not a regulation that makes this. It's the absence actually of a regulation that would give us a right, a civic right to have health insurance, regardless of whether we can pay or not.
There's not, I don't know about evidence in terms of the other stuff that we can ecology. I tend to think in terms of PTs per capita as a surrogate for all kinds of things in society. But as a systems planner in the healthcare delivery system and a policy analyst, I know that healthcare in the United States is dangerous to your health. And there is very clear evidence now that healthcare has actually been responsible for shortening longevity rather than adding to it. Particularly since we had this economic depression and people they stopped using healthcare, and all of a sudden longevity started going back up.
Well, that's simply that's a good joke. It's simply not. That's a good joke. It's simply not true. Every European country has universal health insurance, and every European country has a longer life expectancy than we do. And the most stark comparison to me always is, our neighbor Cuba. If at that level of economic development, you can live almost as long as we do, where they spend maybe 3% or 4% of GNP, of much smaller GNP on health. And we spend 15%, and we don't get the bang for our buck. Yes, it's the health system which is broken, and we still insist on doing it the way we have been doing it, and we don't get the money for it. Yeah. All right. Okay, let's move on.
Let's move on.
More
questions.
Pardon me? No. The next issue is population control versus family planning. I come from a perspective where I feel, where I argue, it's not a question of feeling, where I argue that each family should have a right to determine the size of their children. I don't want the government to tell people how many children they should have. In most cases, we don't really need this, because I showed you the graph. If there's development, if there are long-term trends, This is a process. We have seen enough countries that have gone through this demographic transition. People will end up with small families if they see opportunities that small families really make sense. So therefore, I don't think we should talk about, we should use the term population control, but we should use the term family planning in the, defined as the ability of a family to have the number of children it wants to have. That means that ready access to birth control. It doesn't mean abortion as a means of birth control, but if there's a need for abortion, of course, also. It means a whole bunch of things. I will talk about policy just in a couple of minutes. There are some exceptional circumstances. China just grew by leaps and bounds, and they decided to go to the one-child policy, one-child family. It probably was a good thing to have done. They were able to slow their population growth. They are, any time now, no longer the largest country in the world. It's soon going to be India, because India never has had successful family planning, even though all sorts of stuff has been tried out there since 1970. So India will soon be the largest country. It has helped China develop, but the cost of that development, and you read in the newspaper every day, has been quite devastating for a lot of people. There's a lot of poverty. There are a lot of millionaires too, but there's a lot of poverty. And it causes imbalances in the age structure. That is, because the thing happens so quickly, suddenly you don't have enough people who are in the labor force, because suddenly very few people were born. I'll show you more about this in a minute. And it has caused a problem in the sex ratio. Sex ratio is essentially the number of women to number of men. And in China there is still a strong preference for males. So females either get aborted before they're born, since we now have the technology to find out the sex of the child. There's a certain amount of infanticide after kids are born, after babies are born, if it's a girl, or the babies aren't, the girls aren't quite as nourished, so they die. There are not pretty things associated with this one-child policy. So from a standpoint of bringing population under control, it worked. From a social and economic standpoint, there are a lot of issues, there are a lot of problems it has caused. So by and large, unless you have unless there's a real issue where we have to bring population growth under control, to move to those drastic steps is really not well advised, and frankly, outside of a totalitarian system, it's almost impossible to achieve. And if the cost of that would be a political and social system of China, I probably would move to a different country. I wouldn't want us to have that sort of thing here. Another issue I think to discuss is that it's the issue of public interest versus private interests. People do what's best for them, and what's good for society is not always good for it's not always good for families. In our society, children are consumption goods. All of us who have children know that the flow of money is a one-way street. And it is not from the younger to the older generation, all right? In developing countries, in very poor countries, or among the very poor even of richer countries, children can be consumption goods. In fact, when we were an agricultural society, children were more a production good. In other words, the production, or if you want, the reproduction cost of a child was lower than what the child would yield. I spent some time in Brazil. I lived a little bit in Rio, the favelas, slums. I've read anthropological studies. Essentially, what you have is that, and you see it when you go to Mexico. You see it when you go to to poor countries. Very young children are at street corners, at street lights. They clean your windshield, they sell you chewing gum. Rio has all these beaches, and a lot of life takes place on the beaches. Beaches are very important to cariocas, as they're called. Their citizens are called in Rio. You don't have to go shopping. You go to the beach, you sunbathe, you swim, and everything that you need to buy comes by through traders, and they're often children. And then, of course, if you want to beg, if you have a little child, people are more generous and give you more money. In those countries where people are poor, the very poor have no access to education. So for them, it doesn't matter whether you have 3, 4, 5 children. They don't cost much. We all like children. Most of us have fewer children than we wish because we can't afford to have more children, because we want to give our children opportunities. If we do not see that our children have opportunities, why would we limit the number of children? Not many of us are altruistic and say, yeah, it's good for society and therefore I will do it. And most of us do what's good for us, no? I mean, within limits. So that's why I'm coming back to the point that the best contraceptive, the best way to bring down fertility is to show families that there are opportunities, to integrate people that are excluded. The poor are excluded a lot, so that the issue, for example, of minimum wage is not just equality or something like this. It's really citizenship. If you have to have 2 or 3 jobs, how can you participate in a democratic society? Yeah, you can vote, but you can't really participate in the institution that we call a civic society. And we know from most of our societies that there's a strong correlation between income of the parents and income of the children. We don't have that much social mobility. The rags to riches story, the Rockefeller, stuff, exists, of course, in any country you find anything. I mean, there's always one case. But in general, I mean, you just look, it's just a question of the data. And the data show that if you're middle class, you automatically go to college. You don't have to be motivated. We have some famous people who screwed up in college and they made it high in government, and you can attach names to these things as you wish. But my point is that we don't live in a closed society, right? So anyone can do it. But if I'm very poor, I would have to be overly motivated to get to where I could be if I came out of the middle class. I can be average. And because I have networks, my parents would have networks, I automatically go there, all right? To the extent that we increase those kind of opportunities for people who historically have been excluded, minorities, women, the poor, we give people incentives to have fewer children. And we don't need coercive measures to punish you and put you in jail if you have a second child, all right? The tempo, I alluded to this before, the tempo of how quickly we bring things down really matters. And there's an issue with the disruption, what I call the disruption of the age structure. And I show you a chart here. These are 3 what we call population pyramids. All right, they're built up, each bar is an age group. And to the left, in this case, are males, to the right are females. All right? In a country that has a high fertility rate, you have a real pyramid with a very sort of flat slope. You almost could walk up. In a country that is not growing, you need to be a mountain climber to get up because it's a very steep slope. All right? So the right pyramid, which is essentially Austria, Denmark, or Italy, the youngest age group is almost as large as, let's say, the age group 50 to 59. It very gradually only on top sort of, at one point we will all die. Now here's the thing, that if you bring population growth, if you reduce population growth too rapidly, take the left pyramid and think of the fact, let's say we want immediately we want to have negative population growth. That will